And welcome to this presentation of the New England chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists. I'm Irwin Gratz from the nearby Maine professional chapter, and in just a minute, I'll be talking with John Adams about his work to shine a light on the impact so-called dark money has in politics. We'll also be taking some time before we end to answer any questions you might have. Please feel free to enter them in the chat function, and I'll ask them as time allows. First, though, a word about our guest. He's lived through both one of the depressing and one of the hopeful trends in the journalism business. A former correspondent for USA Today and Capitol Bureau Chief of the Great Falls Tribune in Montana, John was forced to strike out on his own. But he then founded and is now editor of the Montana Free Press, a nonprofit organization that continues his work of investigative journalism and produces stories that once again appear in the newspaper he once worked for. John was also the subject of an acclaimed documentary entitled Dark Money. It explored the corrupting influence of untraceable corporate spending in political campaigns and Montana's efforts to rein in such spending. John, welcome. Nice to have you.
It's good to be here, Irwin.
You know, for those folks who may be watching and don't know, what are we talking about when we talk about dark money?
Well, there's a lot of forms that dark money comes, but mainly what we're talking about at its fundamental level is money that is spent in political elections that can't be traced to the person who's spending it. And that can happen in a variety of ways. Mostly it happens through nonprofit issue advocacy organizations that are organized under the IRS code 501c4. Montana Free Press and a lot of other nonprofits are organized under IRS code 501c3. That designation, that tax exempt designation, doesn't allow us to engage in political activity or political advocacy. Under 501c4, you can engage in a certain amount of political advocacy, and I think it's 51% of the work that you do has to be on educating somebody on the issues that you purport to care about. The other 49% can be spent on direct electioneering, and that's whether or not these groups are educating people when they send out the hundreds of thousands of postcards in these elections, or whether or not they are actually advocating for a particular political position or a political candidate, I think is up for debate. And another way that dark money is spent in elections is these individual nonprofit groups. They may give to a legitimate 501c, or I'm sorry, a legitimate political action committee. Political action committees do have to disclose their donors to the Federal Elections Commission, and in most cases, their state elections officials. But the money that they receive could come from these 501c4s that don't disclose. So there's lots of ways that dark money is happening in elections. And now as we head into the digital age, or as we're deep into the digital age, a lot of that stuff is now happening. And it's even trickier to track now than it had been in the past.
Well, we'll get into some of that later.
Yeah.
When did you first begin to encounter political contributions that would be considered dark money that you couldn't trace?
Yeah, for those of you who've seen the film Dark Money, there's a scene in the film where I talked to a former state legislator. His name was John Ward. He was a Republican legislator in the House from here in the Helena Valley, and he came into my office after the 2007 election. I had just started my new job as the Capitol reporter for the Great Falls Tribune. And John Ward came into my office and he put a stack of postcards on my desk and he said, "There's something really wrong happening here. This is something different." And as I said in the film, I sort of dismissed his complaints as, those of a disgruntled politician who'd been defeated, in the messy game of politics. What I didn't really realize was that the groups that were attacking him, the methods that they were using, and the fact that they were hiding behind these 501c4 designations, that was new. And that was something that I didn't really realize until we headed into the 2008 and then 2010 elections. And then we really started looking around and saying, who is this group, Western Tradition Partnership? That at the time was the dark money group that was really having a lot of impacts on our legislative races here in Helena or in Montana.
Yeah. And so you mentioned that he was a Republican. It seemed from the interviews that were conducted for the documentary that in Montana, at least, the concern over dark money was initially bipartisan.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, most of the spending that we saw happening in those early years in 2007, 2009, I'm sorry, 2006, 2008, 2010, and 2012, a lot of that money was really being concentrated in Republican primaries. And so Montana's a conservative state. Our legislature tends to be conservative, controlled by the Republican Party, both the House and the Senate. All but two sessions since I've been here, the Democrats have controlled one session or one body or the other by very razor thin margins. And so with Republicans being generally the ruling party in the legislative branch, the question becomes, what faction of the Republican Party is going to have a ruling majority in that caucus. And what we saw with these dark money attacks in 8, 10, and 12 was really centered around the fact of ousting incumbent, quote unquote, moderate Republicans who, had a propensity to work with the minority Democrats and the Democratic governor to pass key legislation like the budget, like healthcare expansion, education funding, those sorts of things. And so what we saw was these dark money groups coming in and spending heavily and at the last minute and in a very sophisticated way in these legislative primaries that typically would only see in a some of these districts you only see a few $1,000s spent in a typical election, but some of these races we saw tens of thousands of dollars being spent, and we saw very sophisticated campaigns underway in what had traditionally been kind of retail politic, lots of door knocking and that sort of thing, phone calls and that sort of thing. We saw a much more sophisticated campaign and these really highly designed and very persuasive attack mailers that started showing up in these elections. And yeah, it was primarily targeting um, Republicans in conservative districts. So you knew that whoever won the outcome of that primary was likely to hold that seat in the legislature. We didn't see as much of that activity in more competitive districts where Republicans and Democrats, swing districts. You mostly saw it happening in um, conservative districts where the incumbent had a record of working with the Democrats in the governor's office and the legislature.
Now, one of the important things that plays into all of this is a Supreme Court case known as Citizens United versus the FEC. Talk about the role that played in upsetting the regime that was in place for contributions to political campaigns and perhaps contributed to dark money as well.
Yeah, now keep in mind that dark money did exist prior to Citizens United.
Mm-hmm.
But what Citizens United said in 2010 was basically that corporations had the same rights as individuals to spend freely in elections. And that was the big shift. And in Montana, we had a law on the books dating back to 1912 called the Corrupt Practices Act. And the Corrupt Practices Act sprang out of a series of events that occurred primarily in the 1909 and 1911 legislatures where popular reforms to get corruption out of Montana politics. Montana had a long history of corruption in politics dating back to its founding. We're a resource rich state. The resource at the time, at the turn of the last century, was copper. And the copper barons from Butte, Montana, really controlled a lot of the state's politics. And there was one company in particular, the Amalgamated Copper Company. It went on to become the Anaconda Copper Company, was one of the largest companies in the world. And they were based in what is a pretty small town of Anaconda, Montana. But the Amalgamated Copper Company wielded huge influence in the legislature. And so there were key efforts in 1909 and 1911 to reform. There were two things that they wanted: to take the primary selection process out of the hands of the political party committees and put them in the hands of the voters. So direct primary law was the first thing that they wanted. And the second thing that they wanted is they wanted to send a reform-minded senator, because back then the all legislatures selected the senators who represented them in the United States Senate. Well, those two reforms were stymied in back-to-back sessions. Primarily, it was pretty obvious that the Amalgamated Copper Company had influenced legislators with gifts and lavished them with cigars and who knows what else. Um, and so in 1912, by popular initiative, the Montanans passed by overwhelming majorities the direct primary law and the Corrupt Practices Act, which prohibited direct corporate spending in elections. So here in Montana, that law stood until 2010 when Citizens United said, nope, that's unconstitutional. Corporations can spend directly in elections. Montana challenged that law. Then Attorney General Steve Bullock, who went on to become a governor, who's now running for United States Senate, he challenged that law, but then he lost in a summary decision in the United States Supreme Court in 2012. They struck down our almost exactly 100-year-old Corrupt Practices Act. And so what that did is that basically said corporations can indeed directly spend on elections. And so that includes these 501c4 nonprofit corporations could spend directly in elections. And then we also had, up until that time, we had pretty strict and very small contribution limits to campaigns. Those also change. So we've increased our contribution limits. We still have some pretty tight contribution limits relative to a lot of other states. But yeah, for a period of time there, it was kind of a free-for-all in Montana where corporations could spend almost as much as they wanted in our elections. And that's what we saw in 2012 and 2014.
Yeah, I was going to say, so you did actually see, as a kind of a result of Citizens United and its application to Montana, that the amount of dark money suddenly ballooned.
Yeah, and it's worth pointing out that we've been talking a lot about the fact that most of this dark money spending that we saw by groups like Western Tradition Partnership and American Tradition Partnership, that early dark money, that was primarily occurring in Republican primaries, also in some general election races, primarily against Democrats. But in 2012, we saw a significant amount of dark money spending by Democrats or groups supporting Democrats. In fact, John Tester, in his second race for the United States Senate, at the last minute, a group tied to Tester and tied to Democratic operatives called Backcountry Hunters and Anglers spent about $1 million on a TV ad for the Libertarian candidate in that race. Montana has a strong Libertarian streak, you could say, and the Libertarian Party is qualified for the ballot here in Montana. And so in every race, there's a Libertarian candidate who usually takes anywhere from 2 to 5 percentage points of the vote. Presumably those votes are peeled away from Republican candidates. That's sort of the conventional wisdom among politicos. And so they spent $1 million promoting a Libertarian candidate in 2012, and Tester narrowly won that election in 2012 by, I think, fewer than 10,000 votes. And the Libertarian candidate in that race took about 5 percentage points of that vote. So we have seen that happen on Democrat side as well. But it's definitely, it's definitely been a problem on both sides.
So talk a little bit about, you clearly have been able to have some idea of where the dark money is coming from, and in addition to what it appears to be doing, who it's going to. How have you been able to trace some of it?
Well, some of it we have and some of it we haven't. I mean, in the case, the events depicted in the film Dark Money, this group, Western Tradition Partnership, the group that had been really actively campaigning in these Republican primaries, the only reason we know where that money came from and who is behind that, or at least which organization was largely behind that, which corporation was backing it, is because of a series of kind of freak events. Leaked documents, emails that came out in trial, and that sort of thing. So there were a lot of pieces that had to sort of be pieced together. In the case of that, in that case, Western Tradition Partnership, internal documents from a company called Direct Mail and Communications, which was one of the companies that was sort of behind all of this, the sort of functioning of this dark money campaign that wasn't just an outside group independently spending on behalf of or against particular candidates, but they were actually directly coordinating with individual candidates. They were promising in exchange, presumably in exchange for some kind of quid pro quo at the legislature. The quid pro quo was never, I think, directly proven, but the implication was that these candidates knew that they were receiving services, including walking lists, including websites, including targeted email lists, including letters written on their behalf, purportedly from themselves and their wives and that sort of thing, spouse letters, they called them. That they didn't pay for. So they were getting all of these campaign services that had a lot of value to them that they weren't paying for. We found out about all of that because of a lengthy investigation that started when several boxes of internal documents somehow showed up purportedly at a meth house in Colorado. Somehow wound up in the hands of Democratic Party officials in Colorado who shipped them to Montana, where they sat unopened for several weeks until somebody noticed them and looked at them and said, huh, this is interesting, because inside those boxes were files on these individual candidates and all of the campaign services that were provided to them. That's what triggered the investigation. That investigation um, led to complaints, civil election violation complaints. Again, I think there were 13 candidates in all over the course of several election cycle that were investigated and eventually settled. One of those was a state senator named Art Whittick, who was he was the one who did not settle with the state regulator, opted instead to take it to trial. And during the course of discovery in that trial, more emails from workers who worked at these corporations that were participating in this dark money, those files were revealed. And then the reason we knew about it in the press was because we filed public information requests with state regulators who turned over a lot of those discovery documents to us for inspection. And so by spending time poring over thousands of pages of documents, we were kind of able to piece this network together, as was the regulator who took the case to court and got a guilty verdict in a jury trial.
The other thing that has, I know, happened in Montana is, after several years, there is a new campaign finance law that is focused on disclosure of the sources of dark money. And I guess one of the things I'm kind of curious about is that statute holding up in the era of Citizens United court actions. Has anybody challenged that in court yet?
Yeah, so what that law does is it doesn't prevent corporations from spending in elections, but what it says is if you're going to spend on electioneering communication within a certain window of time prior to the election, I think it's 60 days, um, that you have to disclose what you're spending that money on and where that money is coming from. And so what that's done, it has to a certain degree limited the amount of dark money that's being spent, right leading up to an election. However, what those groups can then do is they can take whatever money that they have raised or had available to spend, and as a 501c4, contribute it to a quote unquote light money PAC, political action committee. That political action committee can then spend that money. They have to disclose that they spent it, and they have to disclose who they got their money from. But if you got your money from, dark money nonprofit A, that's all that's disclosed. You don't necessarily know who the donors are that gave to dark money PAC A, So, so there's still a lot of gray area there. But incidentally, a lot of the money that we've seen being spent in this year's elections actually hasn't been dark money. A lot of the money ultimately we've been able to trace back to the people who've made the contributions. So it's unclear to me at this point just the extent to which we're seeing dark money, and part of that is because we don't know how much money is being spent on digital platforms that aren't disclosing that their campaign ads. So Facebook, YouTube, Google, some of the bigger tech platforms do require a certain level of disclosure. You have to go through kind of a rigorous process to be able to run ads of a political nature. But a lot of streaming platforms don't require that. Tubi, Hulu, Roku, some of these other on-demand services that people are using to stream content, from TV shows to movies to you name it. A lot of those platforms are now delivering directly, highly targeted, micro-targeted political advertisements to individual viewers based on largely on algorithms that, tell the ad buyer that those people might be swayable, based on their viewing habits, their spending habits, their, Facebook habits, you name it. Um, so as these advertisers are tracking more and more and more and more and collecting more and more data about who we are and how we behave online, they can put together pretty sophisticated profiles, which they can then sell to advertisers. And if those platforms aren't disclosing who's buying and who's spending and what they're saying, then you really don't know what's happening. It's really kind of a black box. And so I think a lot of the dark money has moved into those platforms, but it's almost impossible to tell, because the data isn't publicly available for researchers, watchdogs, journalists, regulators to really kind of dig into it.
Initially, Montana's Corrupt Practices Act, of course, stemmed from a belief, not unreasonable, that too much money in politics can lead to a bad place, can lead to corruption. I've been kind of wondering about this nationally, and I wonder in Montana too. First of all, is the public still exercised about the sheer amount of money that's being spent on political campaigns?
Yeah, I mean, I've yet to hear from somebody who tells me that they love pulling 15, glossy postcards out of their mailbox every day. I mean, if you follow the social media chatter and you see what people are saying in various Facebook groups and Twitter and that sort of thing, we don't have a ton of good polling that I'm aware of in the state. It's tough to poll in Montana for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is it's very expensive, and we're such a diverse and diluted state population wise that it's kind of a challenge to get good polling. And I think when people do poll, that's not a question they tend to ask. But anecdotally, I've never heard anybody say that they are okay with the level of money in politics. I think a lot of people are very concerned about it. I mean, Montana really does have a tradition of being sort of, put off at the very least. There was a Democratic candidate for governor several years ago who started off his campaign with a $100,000 check to himself, and a lot of people think that uh, really torpedoed his campaign because it was viewed as sort of a rich person trying to buy the election. Well, we have a governor candidate running this time around who's put $7 million into his campaign. And as far as we can tell from the polling, he's neck and neck with his Democratic rival. So, that in a conservative state that Trump won by 20 points, a sitting congressman with that kind of money in his campaign, you would think would have more of an edge in the polls. But I think the fact that he's still, neck and neck with his Democratic rival, I think kind of indicates that Montanans do have some hesitation about, that kind of money in elections.
I've also kind of wondered, though, in the last, I'd say over the last decade, because I kind of trace it back to Barack Obama's first run in 2008, the Democrats have gotten much better at fundraising in races against Republicans. Matter of fact, it appears in this race, Joe Biden's campaign may very well outraise Donald Trump. I'm kind of wondering if among politicians that you talk to, whether some of the opposition hesitancy about spending is perhaps lessening now that both parties can kind of have figured out how to open the tap.
That's a good question. I mean, I think that there's less hesitancy to spend. Look, if the reason money buys influence is because if you want a $10,000 check from somebody, you have to go meet them face to face. That's access. Access equals influence, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
if somebody writes a $10 check, does Joe Biden care what they think? But if somebody can write a $10 million check to a political action committee, is Joe Biden going to take that phone call? Or is, Senator Steve Daines or is Senator Lindsey Graham, you name it. I mean, if you have major dollar donors who have the ability to write checks and large sums of monies to political action committees or give directly to campaigns, they have greater access to those politicians, and presumably they have greater influence over outcomes of particular legislation. If you know that your major donors want something, then you're likely to deliver it. The reason transparency matters in this situation is because if the public can see that XYZ Corporation wrote a $5 million check to a PAC that supports a senator, and then that senator votes in favor of a bill that benefits XYZ Corporation, those of us in the press can tell the public about that. And the public can make a decision about whether or not they think that that vote might have been influenced by that contribution. If we don't know where that contribution's coming from, where that money's coming from, then we don't know whether or not that politician is being influenced, perhaps unduly, by a particular, special interest individual or corporation. So, getting back to your question about are they hesitant to spend the money? I mean, you hear this argument all the time that you got to fight fire with fire, or Democrats can't unilaterally disarm in the dark money race. These kinds of arguments, but I talked to Anna Masolia from the Center for Responsive Politics, opensecrets.org, and she spends a lot of time researching dark money. And her research has found that when you try to quote unquote fight fire with fire, what ends up happening is the other side flips the message. And so what we've seen a lot in this election cycle is a lot of these sort of conservative leaning third party groups disclosing their spending, and then Republicans kind of flipping the narrative and talking about the dark money that's benefiting Democrats. And certainly we've seen over the last couple election cycles more and more dark money being spent on the Democratic side than the Republican side. And you're seeing it around Supreme Court nominations. You're seeing it around, certainly our elections. But there are these major events that happen where these dark money groups come in and spend a tremendous amount of money trying to influence behaviors of elected officials. And if you don't know where it's coming from, you don't really know who's behind it, and you don't know if there's quid pro quo going on.
And correct me if I'm wrong, I think one of the things the Supreme Court of the United States has said in some of its rulings against campaign finance restrictions is that they think that disclosure is the best way to deal with it.
Yep.
And I know a lot of people think that's been naive on the part of the justices because the disclosure doesn't happen, but that is what they've been saying and suggesting perhaps should be done.
Yeah, and that was one of the hallmarks of Citizens United, was the anticipation. I think it was Justice Kennedy that wrote that it doesn't matter if there's unlimited corporate spending because disclosure will provide the transparency that the public needs to know. But you're right, that hasn't happened, and we have on the federal level a Federal Elections Commission that hasn't had a functional governing quorum, I think, in the last 2 or 3 years. Certainly in the last year. And so even if there were to be any major action on election, political corruption complaints on the federal level, there isn't a body that can enforce those. It's not functioning. And even when they are a quorum, it's 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans, and so they tie on almost every major decision that comes before them. And so there hasn't been any real progress on this issue at the federal level in more than a decade.
Yeah. Before I go on, let me just remind those who are watching, if you have a question you would like to add to this conversation, you can use chat as part of our Zoom meeting. I am not able to monitor our Facebook Live, but I believe we have a couple of our SPJ leaders who may be able to look in and see that and translate those questions onto our Zoom platform if necessary. So I'm curious, in Montana at least, we've been talking about the impact of money that provides access and can affect policy. Are there places in recent Montana history where you can kind of point to policies that have changed because of the influence of dark money?
That's a good question. The short answer is, the short answer is I have not done a complete analysis of that would be an interesting study and one worth going back and looking. Part of the problem is we didn't know what was happening with that dark money, and whether it's sort of like retrospective, right? Like we have to go back and look and see. And to be honest with you, I haven't done that analysis. But yeah, I mean, certainly when many of these folks who got elected voted year after year in legislature after legislature, lots of policies got passed with their input. In many cases, they were serving in leadership positions in the House and the Senate. And so, absolutely, we saw these legislators who benefited from this dark money spending to help them get elected. Um, we saw changes in policy, we saw outcomes. Um, can I definitively say that there are, certain specific laws on the books that would or wouldn't be there today had it not been for dark money? I can't say that with any certainty at this point, but I can definitely say that, you know, these individuals, you know, who were deemed to be supportive of the issues that these organizations cared about, did in fact support those types of legislation as they came forward over the years. Um, Keep in mind, we also had these were primarily Republicans in the legislature who benefited from this dark money. Um, and for 16 years, we've had Democratic governors. So a lot of that legislation never made it past the governor's veto pen. So, but did they try? Certainly.
Yeah. And I mean, the other thing, it's funny when you talk about the fact you haven't had a chance to go back and look at it retrospectively. I mean, it kind of also leads to that other question about journalism, period. I mean, in Montana, it's one of the things that's mentioned in the documentary. Like many places, you've seen a reduction in simply the journalistic core that's covering this stuff, and that also kind of inhibits, I would think, the ability to ferret out this information.
Yeah, no question about it. I mean, what we've seen in the last 10 or 15 years is a precipitous decline in the number of experienced political reporters covering state government and policy at the state house and beyond, not just in Montana, but across the country. This has been a problem. I'm sure many of the people here on this Facebook Live or Zoom call have their own experiences with shrinking newsrooms. That's been a problem, and it continues to be a problem. And so, on the one hand, we have this huge increase in the amount of spending in elections, this huge potential for corruption of our politics by special interest, third party, outside groups who are able to hide their identities, and so we don't know if they're friends, family, and cohorts of these elected officials who they're spending on their behalf. You just don't know, right? So there's this shroud of darkness around all this spending that's happening, and then the people who are sort of trained watchdogs who could go in there and do the kind of investigation that it might take to find out what's really going on is diminished, and so it's kind of this double-edged sword that's really or double whammy that's really, I think, not beneficial to our politics and our governance. Um, and yeah, that's one of the reasons why I started the Montana Free Press, was to try to find a way to continue to do this kind of journalism going forward and preserve that watchdog reporting at the statewide level. Because even if we don't have a huge audience that generates a lot of clicks for advertisers, our reporting has impact and really matters to set the record straight on what's going on at the Capitol.
Yeah, how is Montana Free Press doing? I mean, is it turning out to be a good going concern? Are you able to finance it?
We are, yeah. It's been a tough, it wasn't easy to get it off the ground. I mean, telling a story about nonprofit news and why what we do matters was a little bit tricky at first. I mean, a lot of people had just spent a long time being taking their traditional newspaper model for granted and not really realizing, as I did in 2015, how broken that model is in most cases, especially for the kinds of markets that we're serving. The fact of the matter is, internet advertising has gutted the traditional newspaper model, and there isn't a way for local news organizations to compete with the likes of Google and Facebook and Twitter and everybody else who has the ability to deliver ads to individuals for a fraction of what it would take to run a newspaper ad It's just a far more effective. You can't compete on the scale that those global platforms can compete on, and so I saw that in 2015, and I really believe that the only way it would survive is through sort of a public service model, one in which the public media, much like public radio, public television, you have it, you name it.
Yep.
I believe that that was kind of the way to go, and it took a little while to kind of convince people of that. But now that we've finally gotten a foothold in Montana, our audience continues to grow, our fundraising continues to outpace our expectations. And so this year we were able to triple our news staff from 1 to 3. So we got 3 full-time
Mhm.
reporters, a full-time editor, 4 or 5 regular freelance contributors, and then myself and another business person. And we expect to add some additional news capacity here in the coming months before the next legislature.
And you're not alone. I mean, we have a nonprofit in this state in Maine that seems to be doing well. Of course, at the national level, you have outfit like ProPublica. It's done very, very well. So apparently, it is part of how the journalism will get through this and continue to
Well,
get stories to readers.
one of your neighbors there in New England, Vermont Digger, VT Digger,
Hmm.
is they're one of the leaders in the country on this model, and one that we've looked to, and as we've tried to build out our business plan. So
All right. Well, let's take a couple of questions that have come in. Here's one. One of the things I really found fascinating from the documentary is the real world impact money has had on the state, such as the destruction of the Berkeley Pit. Can you talk a little bit about that and anything that's been done to clean it up?
yeah, well, there will be no cleaning up of the Berkeley Pit. That will be there forever, unless somebody can come up with an engineering marvel to somehow repair that. The Berkeley Pit is one of the world's largest open pit mines, and back in I think it was the early '90s, the company that owned it at the time, Arco, they decided that it wasn't profitable anymore, and so they turned off the pumps that were dewatering the mines beneath Butte and in the pit, and so the pit filled up with acid mine runoff, and so that it's now a giant pit of basically it's I guess the acidity of the Berkeley Pit is similar to the acidity of your stomach acid. So it's enough to kill wildlife. Nothing really grows in it. That being said, it's not just the Berkeley Pit. Butte itself and a lot of the areas downstream of the Berkeley Pit, Silverbow Creek, it's that all makes up this gigantic Superfund complex. I think it's the largest Superfund complex in the country, and they are now kind of entering into the final stages of putting in a plan into action to clean up as much of it as they can. Um, so that destruction happened because there was um, essentially unmitigated corruption, environmental law. The the Amalgamated Copper Company, which went on to be the Anaconda Copper Company, had what was known as the copper collar on Montana for the better part of the 20th century. And it wasn't until they kind of started to collapse in the late 1950s and 1960s that that grip on Montana's politics really started to loosen. But throughout that era, they got a lot of what they wanted at the legislature, and they owned most of the state's major daily newspapers, and so they controlled a lot of the flow of information that the public was getting. They controlled a lot of the influence at the legislature. They had teams of lawyers that would go up there and help lawmakers help them write bills and legislation. That was before the legislature had its own independent body called the Legislative Services Division that helps them, a staff of lawyers that works for the legislature that helps them write bills. Prior to that, the company used to help them write bills, which meant that a lot of bills got written in their favor. So yeah, that corruption is what led to, in 1972, Montana writing a new constitution. And that new constitution, in the preamble of the Constitution, is the right to a clean and healthful environment. It's the only constitution, I think, in the country that requires a clean and healthful environment. And as such, you've seen a lot of improvement over the last several decades to clean up Montana's environment. And that was in direct response to company control of the press, of the legislature, of our politics.
All right, here's another question relating to our discussion of fighting fire with fire. The questioner writes, how do we get out of this cycle of conservatives and progressives spending more and more and flipping the narrative? Do we have to wait for another Supreme Court ruling?
Oh, that's a tough one. Unlikely to get one for any foreseeable future, I think. I don't think you're going to see Citizens United overturned. That being said, it's feasible that you could have on the federal level legislation that mirrors what we have here in Montana on the state level. There's nothing that prevents Congress from passing campaign finance reform that requires disclosure. So there are, I think, some ways that it could be done. Um, I always say, if this is something that matters to you, if this is something that you care about, if you think people around you care about it, then people need to demand from their elected officials, regardless of their political party, that they support efforts to increase transparency. I think that's where it has to start. Is I think if we have more transparency, then at least we can kind of see where the influence is coming from. As far as limiting spending, I don't know how we're ever going to put that genie back in the bottle. I mean, there were
Uh,
bipartisan attempts to do that in the 90s and 2000s, and they've been overturned at every turn. So I don't know how
yeah,
we put that genie in the bottle.
yeah. The Supreme Court, in a decision in Buckley versus Vallejo, even before Citizens United, made the came across with the principle that money equals speech in some
Hmm.
ways, and that made it a First Amendment issue, and many of the decisions have followed since then. Interestingly, though, there was a movement. I'm going to say a couple 3 years ago for a constitutional amendment on campaign finance reform, and I believe it was retired Justice John Paul Stevens who actually went and testified on its behalf in a congressional committee, but that hasn't gone very far either. But it is certainly another way one a change could occur in
Well,
theory.
in 1912, when Montana passed the Corrupt Practices Act, the narrative around here is, that this was something that was unique to Montana. It wasn't. This was a wave of populist reform that swept the country at the time. This kind of corruption was occurring all over the place. Montana's law was basically copied verbatim from Oregon's Corrupt Practices Act. So these Corrupt Practices Act popped up all over the West, and I think in other parts, but it was these populist reforms meant to put the power back in the hands of the people because people demanded it. And, I think that it is possible, but it's harder and harder these days, I think, in large part because of the way that we interact online and just how much the messaging that we all receive on a near constant basis is sort of selected for us by algorithms. And I think until we somehow crack that open, nothing's going to change.
Yeah. Let's see. Also, kind of a comment and a question. We appreciate your efforts to support grassroots journalism. Do you see another Citizens United like Supreme Court case on the horizon? Um, and I
Yeah,
don't know the answer to that.
yeah, I don't either. And I have to say, this is not an area of expertise for me these days. Very much of my, to be honest, most of my focus these days is how do I continue to grow this journalism outfit to maintain, a strong, healthy, vibrant state house presence in Montana. And so I haven't spent a ton of time researching what's going on the national level with various legal efforts to try to upend Citizens United. But I think I don't see a Citizens United like case on the horizon. I've certainly not heard any of. I just interviewed Ellen Weintraub, who's one of the three sitting Federal Elections Commission chair people. I interviewed Anna Masolia from Center for Responsive Politics, um, and there isn't a lot of hope for legal rescue from this on the
Mm.
horizon. what there is hope for is that people-powered movements will gain steam, and that the pressure will get high enough that elected officials feel that they have no other choice but to take action on this issue, or face the wrath of voters. But we're not there yet.
Yeah. Somebody asks, what are your thoughts on politicians who've been trying to focus on small campaign donations, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren? And I think
Well,
that's one of the ways that Democrats have actually succeeded in doing better in fundraising in recent years.
absolutely. You're seeing, I think, people like Bernie Sanders. I think the Democrats would have laughed him off a few years ago. But because he's able to raise such large sums of money by going to individual small dollar donors instead of the PACs, instead of the corporations, instead of the special interests, um, that has really shown that there is power in those small dollar voters. And so I think there are some reforms. I mean, there's I think Seattle has these things called democracy vouchers, where you get a certain number of dollars basically as a voter that you can sort of direct to individual candidates. And this is, public finance. There are different public financing models out there on state and large city models. New York City has a version of it as well, where you're seeing that if the electors, or I'm sorry, if the politicians are forced to go to the individuals. If the individual's dollar has more impact, has more sway than the corporation's dollar, then people are going to go to the individuals. Or at least, if you can go to a room full of 10 people and come away with $100,000, you can go to a room full of 100 people and come away with $100,000. That's a little bit more balanced than if you go to a room. You have to go to a room, with 50,000 people to get the same amount as the 10,000 or 10 people. If you can follow what I'm trying to say there. Um, the bottom line is, if more politicians go to a greater number of people to get their donations, they're more representative of the voices of the people rather than the voices of the corporations
Yeah, sure.
or the special interests.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Maine is one of the places also that has had
Yeah.
public campaign finance laws. One of the interesting things that happens to them, though, is unless they're robustly funded, what we're finding in Maine is fewer and fewer politicians are going that route simply because they can't afford to compete
Yeah.
at the levels of public financing they get. And of course, it wasn't actually all that long ago that presidential candidates were competing using the federal fund during the general election season, something that is now gone by the boards.
Can I ask Maine went to ranked choice voting as well,
It
right?
did.
And will this be the first election?
This will be the first presidential election under ranked choice voting. We actually used it 2 years ago in our congressional election, and it actually ended up. I don't want to really call it flipping because that's not what it did, but it did in the end benefit a Democratic candidate for Congress in our second district. The Republican candidate won a plurality, but not a majority. And when the ranked choice recounts were conducted, votes that had gone to another progressive candidate eventually combined with the Democrat to elect him. That's Jared Golden, who's now the second district congressman who's running for re-election this year.
I know there's a lot of talk nationally that ranked choice voting is one of the potential, solutions to help, kind of level the playing field as well.
Well, it was born in Maine out of, this is getting a little bit off topic, but it's interesting. It was born out of a gubernatorial election in which three strong candidates ran, including an independent. And the guy who won with the plurality was Paul LePage, the Republican, but he won with 38% of the vote. And that really activated a lot of independents and Democrats to say, whoa, how do we avoid this happening again? And one of the answers was ranked choice voting. Had it been in effect for that election, it's possible that LePage would not have won the governorship. Now, we also have constitutional restraints on ranked choice voting, so it's still not used in our governor's races, but it is now used in federal elections, and this year will be used in the presidential election as well.
We'll be watching.
Yeah. Hey, let me just take a look, see. No, I think we've gotten to all the questions. So John, let me take a moment on behalf of the Society of Professional Journalists. Thank you very much for taking the time and talking to us today.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
And the documentary itself, is it still out there to be viewed by folks? And where might they find it?
It is. It's still airing on public radio, or I'm sorry, public television stations around the country. You can check your local listings there. It's streaming online at on PBS.org. POV is the strain you want to look for. It's also on. It's available to down or watch for free if you're an Amazon Prime subscriber, or you can rent it on Amazon Prime or a lot of your other streaming platforms of your choice.
All right. We can't leave without making a pitch. If you're watching us, if you're a journalist, we would love to have you as a member of the society. And you can always find out more about that at spj.org, our website. And so thank you very much for joining us this afternoon on behalf of John Adams. I'm Irwin Gratz. Have a nice afternoon or evening.